Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. I'm Wilde, Finance Officer, working at the 2C Secretariat, and today we are going to watch a video about state aid. So state aid will be covered through three main points. First, we will define or try to define state aid. Then we will see who is concerned and who might not be concerned. So you will see that some organizations are not concerned about state aid, and the 2C's approach, going through how we deal with it in the 2C's program in terms of risk assessment and on the electronic exchange platform, so-called the EEP. So first, let's try to define state aid. State aid is defined under the article of the treaty 107.1. Instead of giving you this very lengthy definition about state aid, I've preferred to define it through five cumulative criteria that have all to be fulfilled in order to be considered state aid. So if there is one that is not fulfilled, it means, as you've understood, that there is no state aid. So first, you have to see if the aid has been granted to an undertaking. So what is an undertaking, you would ask yourself? An undertaking is an organization that carries out economic activity. You would also ask yourself, what is an economic activity then? An economic activity is, unfortunately, broadly defined as offering goods and services on a market, on a given market. And that's how state aid is complicated, because it's quite subjective. So you would also ask yourself, are there any non-economic activities? And this is the key question. There are, because you could imagine that state prerogative, for example, essential state prerogatives such as public education, anti-pollution surveillance, police, for example, are non-economic or considered as non-economic. A second criteria would be, does the aid distort the competition? Is there an economic advantage? In that case, we will ask, or you will ask yourself, whether the aid is giving you a benefit compared to other competitors on the market. If that's the case, we could imagine that it gives you an economic advantage, an undue economic advantage. You could also ask yourself whether on the market, if you receive that aid, with other operators would do the same for a remuneration. If that's the case, that could lead to an economic advantage. Then, is the aid selective? Does it target a specific sector, a specific category of stakeholders, for example, SMEs or large enterprises, or just hospitals? That would be something selective. Or, for example, a specific region, which obviously is the case for the 2C's area. So that is why, under the 2C's program, we consider this criteria automatically fulfilled. Then, another criteria would be, does the aid come from public funding sources? Again, obviously, the 2C's funding is from public sources, meaning that it's automatically and already fulfilled. The third criteria would be, does the aid affect the trade between the member states? So in the way you could imagine competition, you would have to also think about if what you will do will affect the trade between the other member state, and even beyond the border, does my activity is either purely local or can it affect the trade between the member state? In that sense, we could imagine an example of a museum, for example, which is rather clearly an economic activity because it affects competition between, for example, in the entertainment business, the theaters, cinemas, etc. Will my museum, for example, thanks to the aid, receive or strengthen its position compared to other museums? If it's not the case, we could imagine that it's purely local, and in that way, we say that it doesn't affect the trade between member states. So that criteria will not be fulfilled in that case, and then there is no state aid. So as I said, 3 out of the 5 criteria are automatically fulfilled, with a kind of exception for the trade between member states. 2 criteria remain open. So is it an economic activity? From this economic activity, do I have an economic advantage? So who is concerned? As you've probably understood from the 2 open criteria, all organizations can be concerned by state aid, possibly then all applicants, because the two criteria are based on two rather broad definitions. So economic activity and economic advantage remain broad. So you could be easily turned into an undertaking, even though you are a public authority, just because of this broad definition. So the notion of undertaking is neutral with regard to the ownership, with regard to the legal status, whether it's public or private, and financing. So if you have resources from the public or the private sector or both, we basically don't care. The 2Cs approach is based on the risk assessment. As you can see on the video, we have a risk assessment approach based on a regular risk assessment. First, there is a risk identified either high or low, and then based on that risk, we need to put in place mitigation measure. So here we talk about applicant level. So each and every applicant has to think about their potential state aid risk, and at the other side, the activity level. Because, for example, you are an SME, and on the regular business, you are doing economic activities. But for the purpose of the project, it might be that you are only doing activities that are considered non-economic. So in that case, it's particularly important that you think about only what you will do in the project instead of your regular activities. So the example of the SMEs can be easily turned into the public authority example, where usually we talk about non-economic activities, but in the framework of the project, you do economic activities. So first you have identified your risk, and then based on that risk, you select one and only one appropriate mitigation measure, which might have an impact on your activities, because you will have to identify between the activities, whether they are economic, non-economic. It will have an impact on the budget, so it might have an impact on the amount of state aid or aid you can receive. In terms of budget line, some measure you will see later on the video that only relate to some budget line, and in terms of contribution, meaning that if you receive state aid, you can only complement your budget with private sources and own funds. Finally, and that goes for after the application stage, we, as the program and the program member state, will check your risk appreciation and the selected measure. The 2Cs approach on the EEP, so on the Electronic Exchange Platform, is based on 6 steps. So we'll go through step by step. First, this first step covers, as you've understood, the two only open criteria: economic activity, economic advantage. So when you will have to fill in the section on the EEP, we would ask you, and even mostly recommend you, to read the 2Cs guidance carefully, meaning the guidance document that we've developed, but also all the guidance boxes and notes that you can find on the website and on the EEP, to be accurate as possible when you will draft and you will answer to these two yes-no questions, economic activity and economic advantage, where we will expect, even if you select yes or no, a clear justification. We will also expect that you specify the concerned work package, even activity, deliverable, or output that is concerned by the state aid. We will then here also expect if you have first level state aid, so direct state aid, or indirect state aid, second level state aid. For example, and you will find more information in the 2Cs guidance, second level state aid will refer to, for example, a free training session, let's say a business support to specific enterprises, for example. There they receive a free training session, so they might receive an advantage compared to other competitors. This free training session is funded by the 2Cs program. In that case, we could imagine that there is a second level state aid. This is better explained in the 2Cs guidance, and so we would recommend you to have a look at the 2Cs guidance. Fourth point, you will also have to distinguish between the economic and non-economic activities in the framework of these two questions. Now that you have identified whether you have a high risk or a low risk of state aid, you will have to understand if, because there is another layer of complexity, you will have to see if you are eligible to apply the mitigation measures. First, you will have to see if you are eligible, meaning that there will be one yes-no question on the EEP to answer. If it's yes, obviously you will be able to use the mitigation measures. But then, and this is the most important point here, is to categorize yourself and to qualify yourself as either an SME, so a small or medium-sized enterprise, or a large enterprise. What is also important is that, as mentioned on the video, we talk about qualification, so SME's qualification. So it's based on different criteria such as the number of employees, the annual turnover, the annual balance sheet, but also the categorization. Here we talk about different concepts: autonomous enterprise, partner enterprise, linked to the fact of the voting rights of other mother or sister companies, number of shareholders. These things will have to be taken into account because you could be easily turned from a SME to a large enterprise if you try and take these other companies into account. So I would recommend you to use and to read the user guide to the SME definition from the Commission, and also to use the spreadsheet that we've developed called the SME test, available on our website. The other steps on the EEP will be basically the mitigation measures available for you in case you have identified a high risk of state aid. So basically, 3, 4, and 5, 6 steps are the mitigation measures, going from the minimis, Article 20 scheme, 2C scheme, and the other GBER articles. GBER stands for General Block Exemption Regulation, so it's a regulation from the Commission. There is a specific document on it for it, and you can find it on the website as well. 2C scheme is a bunch of 12 articles that have been selected. We will talk about it later on, but what is important here is that you can only select one options. For step 5 and 6, it's even more narrowed because you will have to only select one article, but also to clearly justify the reason why you've applied these options, the specific conditions, and any other specificities linked to the article you've selected. So going through all the available mitigation measures, first we have the de minimis. So the de minimis is a ceiling, a threshold, if you like, of 200,000. So if you need, and if you don't need more, I would say, than 200,000 euro of ERDF in your budget, you might be interested by the de minimis. De minimis, very important point to take into account, is that you have to make sure that you didn't receive any other de minimis from other public granting authorities, for example, or any other granting authority that could have provided you other de minimis. Then in that case, if it's 0, for example, at the moment you are applying, then you can have and receive up to 200,000 ERDF. If you are an SME, so again, you have to qualify yourself as an SME, going through all the criteria linked to the SME definition from the Commission, then you could use, and we would say that it's the most preferred option for you, the Article 20 scheme, because it's really for SMEs participating into ETC, European Territorial Cooperation projects, so Interreg projects, with a maximum of 2 million ERDF available, up to, of course, but a 50% ERDF rate, which has been reduced compared to the 60% of the 2Cs program, which would be the main weakness, let's say. Then there is also the 2C scheme. So the 2C scheme is basically a program selection on all the available GBER articles. So we've selected 12 articles based on different priorities of the program that covers, as you will see in the 2C scheme, RD&I, so research, development, and innovation, clusters, innovation clusters, aid to SMEs in different ways, environmental protection, energy efficiency, so those subjects that are related to the program. One important point as well here is that, as you know, as I said, you will have to select one article of the 2C scheme. So if you select one article, you might have, and you will notice if you read the 2C scheme, you might have to apply specific and restrictive conditions based on the budget lines on the type of enterprises. So some enterprises category, let's say large or small, will receive more or less possibility to receive more or less funding. Type of activities, maybe one article will cover only the investment costs, for example. So these are the things to be taken into account if you apply this article. Points of attention. So as we are working with the declaration process, you, as an applicant, as all applicants of one project, will be and will remain liable for all the information you are provided in the EEP. So going from the categorization and qualification of SME or enterprises, through the way you will set up your budget, and until the very end, the distinction between economic and non-economic activities. As I said earlier, you will have also restrictive conditions apply to the selected mitigation measures. So in that case, we expect from you that you justify and you explain why you have selected this article, but also that you are fulfilling these criteria and conditions. As a last important point, the stated funding rate that you will identify at the end of the counter-check process to see what kind of mitigation measure is most appropriate for you will be the maximum funding rate for you and the maximum amount of public funding you could receive. So let's say, and if you have the example of Article X gives you the possibility to receive 80% of public funding, it would mean that in the end, the 2Cs will stop at 60% possibility of receiving some ERDF. The remaining 20% would only mean that you could receive up to another public money, public aid from another public sources to 20%. And the other and last 20% to make up the 100% will come from either your own funds or the private sources. Revenues and state aid, here we would say that it's the most advantageous part of the state aid. Let's say if you are an SME, then, and you expect to generate revenues, then you don't have to take care about it. Where it's more complicated, it's based on the focus on the Commission to on SMEs rather than on large enterprise. Large enterprise will have to deduct revenues in case they select specific GBER articles or based on the occurrence of the revenues generation. This is to be counter-checked when you are applying, and we expect that you fulfill these conditions as well. More information can be found on the two fact sheets developed on the revenue generation and on state aid, fact sheet 10 and 11 of the program manual. And as I was saying, and I was talking about more information, here is a list of full documents that could be of very important and useful information about the guidance documents, official documents, but also tools that we developed that would be of really added value when you will have to think about the state aid and the possible application to your activity. So, if you would like to have more information on this topic, and if you have any question, please, of course, contact us. Do not hesitate. We remain at your entire disposal, both the territorial facilitators and also the Joint Secretariat. All information is available on the state aid section on the 2C's website that you can see at the bottom of the screen there. And what I would just say now is thank you very much for watching this video, and see you in next videos.